Hey, what's up, Street Talks? The Eric from the Eric Street Photography blog. So I just wanted to do a quick video in terms of discussing what are the quote-unquote best settings to use in street photography. Sorry to say, but there are no best settings in street photography. But I'll just give you guys my personal opinions in terms of what's worked best for me, and also why I think might work best for you. So first of all, know at the end of the day, the settings you use on the camera don't necessarily matter. The most important thing is capturing the decisive moment, a moment you find interesting, and you don't have to shoot everything in fully manual mode. I think one of the biggest common misconceptions in photography is if you don't shoot everything in fully manual mode, you're some sort of newbie and you're not a real photographer. The truth is some of the world's best photographers, even Steve McCurry, Eli Reed, Moises Simon, a lot of Magnum photographers, they actually shoot their camera in P mode, which stands for program mode. And what the camera does automatically is chooses the best aperture and shutter speed based on the scene. And I would say nowadays with digital photography, that's the mode I prefer using the most too, is P mode, program mode. The reason is if you set your camera to P mode, your camera usually gives you a fast shutter speed and a fast depth of field. And there's just one less thing for you to worry about when you're out shooting on the streets, and you can focus more on capturing the decisive moment than worrying about what camera settings you have. And generally what I'll also do is if I shoot in P mode, I'll keep, even during the day, I'll keep the ISO relatively high, around 1600 or 3200, because this will allow my camera to have a faster shutter speed, or it will allow my camera to have a larger f-stop, so f8 to f16, instead of just shooting everything at f4, 2.8 or whatnot. And a lot of people often ask is, how about using auto ISO? I think auto ISO, it's fine if you're probably shooting portraits or your subject's not moving around much. The issue with auto ISO is that your camera often tries to shoot at the slowest shutter speed possible, and therefore the slower your shutter speed is, the less likely you are to capture photos of people that are sharp, that are running around or moving. And a lot other people ask, ISO 1600, 3200, isn't that too high? Aren't my photos all going to be super grainy? The reason why it's good to shoot higher ISOs is because you could always use software to remove noise or grain afterwards. You could never really unblur a photograph. And also I find that in street photography, having a more grainy, gritty image makes the image seem much more real and visceral and feels more street, if anything. Other ways you could shoot street photography is shooting in aperture priority mode. So what happens in aperture priority mode is you could use whatever dial or lever to change the settings of the aperture. And what aperture is it's also known as f-stop. It allows how much, it decides how much light comes into your camera, and the most important thing is it changes the depth of field. And so I think a good default aperture for street photography, if you're shooting in aperture priority mode, is f8. The reason is that it's a nice balance between letting in enough light but also having a deep depth of field. But you might be watching this video and thinking to yourself, wait, don't I just want to shoot at 1.4 or f2? I think that works fine if you're shooting portraits or people who aren't moving around much. But if you're photographing people that are quickly moving in and out the frame, shooting at f8 is preferable because it allows more chances for your photos to be in focus. And furthermore, one of the benefits of shooting f8 is by having a deeper depth of field, it allows for you to make more interesting and complex images. Often when you're starting off in street photography, you shoot with like a 50-1.8 lens or something. You shoot everything at 1.8. And so your subject is sharp and in focus, but the background's blurry. But the issue with that is, I think what makes a great street photograph is to have an interesting background and an interesting subject in the foreground. By shooting at f8, 1.8 or f2 or 1.4, by blurring out the background, you lose context from the scene, which could be very interesting. And so if I set my camera to aperture priority mode, AV mode, I'll also keep my ISO relatively high at around 1600 or 3200. And the way to know if your shutter speed is fast enough is, let's say you're out shooting on the streets and you're at aperture priority mode, f8, ISO 1600, let's say. And if your shutter speed isn't faster than 1/250th of a second, generally your shutter speed is too slow. And let's say you're shooting on a super bright day, ISO 1600, when you're shooting in the light, you might be at like 1/1000th of a second or 1/3000th of a second, whatnot. But when you walk into the shade at f8 during the middle of the day, at ISO 1600, your ISO will be at around 1/250th of a second, which is fast enough to photograph people who are walking. And once again, the reason you do not want to use ISO, auto ISO, is because I actually know some people, what they do is they'll set their camera that they'll manually choose the aperture. So let's say f8, then they'll choose a shutter speed, let's say 500th of a second, and then auto ISO. That's good in a lot of cases because it'll just keep increasing the ISO, so you always have a really fast minimum shutter speed. So let's say 500. But the issue of that is sometimes it's better to have faster than 500th of a second. You want 1,000th of a second, 2,000th of a second, 4,000th of a second. Generally, the faster the shutter speed is, the better. If you have a camera that has a very, very good high ISO capability, so let's say any full frame camera, then perhaps you could set your minimum shutter speed to like 1 over 1,000 or 1 over 2,000, then set auto ISO, then generally most of your photos should be in sharp or good enough. Also, as a practical tip, if you're shooting street photography and your photos are blurry, that just means increase your ISO, because if you increase your ISO, you're going to increase your shutter speed, and the less likely your photos are going to be when they're blurry. And some people might ask about shooting fully manual. Generally, unless your camera is like a fully manual film camera, I don't recommend shooting fully manual. The reason because when you're shooting street photography, life happens so quickly. The last thing you want to worry about is your camera's technical settings. I do also shoot with a film Leica MP camera, which is a fully manual camera, and all it has is a meter. In that situation, I'll generally keep my camera around f8, and I'll keep the ISO consistent. So if I'm shooting with the MP, let's say I'm just shooting with Kodak Portra 400 film, or just default Tri-X film, which is 400. The default settings I'll use when I'm shooting street photography is I'll keep the camera in manual mode. I'll keep it at f8, and the ISO is consistent 400, so I don't change that. And the only factor I'll change is the shutter speed. So if I'm shooting in bright sunlight during the middle of the day, f8, ISO 400, that's about 1 over 1,000th a second. Then let's say if I'm photographing people in the shade, that's at f8, ISO 400, that's usually 1 over 60th of a second. If I'm shooting people at around sunrise or sunset, where you have golden hour, that's generally 1 over 250th of a second. And the good thing about shooting film is things are pretty flexible. If you are shooting digitally, once again, it's generally better to underexpose your photos and overexpose your photos, because in digital, if your photos are overexposed, you'll blow your highlights, and once you blow your highlights and your photos are too bright, you can't recover it in even with RAW with the exposure slider or with the highlight slider. And in digital, if your photos are a little too dark, you can always draw out more details from the shadows. Ironically enough, in film, it's the opposite. Is if your photos are too dark and underexposed, you cannot draw information out from the darks or the shadows. But with film, if your photos are overexposed, there's almost always detail available in the highlights. So once again, to recap, generally don't recommend shooting in fully manual mode unless your camera is a fully manual camera. Oh, sorry, one last thing I failed to talk about is the focusing. So if you're shooting P mode, I just generally recommend using center focus, autofocus, and it's really not the most accurate nor the fastest, but it works best for most people, myself included. Let's say if you're shooting aperture priority at f8, then what I recommend is something called zone focusing, where you switch your camera to manual focusing and you pre-focus your lens. And a good default to pre-focus your lens is about 1.2 meters. And rule of thumb is 1.2 meters is about 2 arm lengths away. And if your camera doesn't have a focusing scale on the lens, then you could just look at a stationary object, whether that be a tree, stick out your arm and just kind of visualize is that around 2 arm lengths away, and then you could pre-focus that distance. And if you're shooting with a 28mm lens or a 35mm lens at f8, you have a pretty good depth of field. So even though you're not perfectly focused on your subject, anything pretty close to 1.2 meters, a little bit further, a little bit closer, will be pretty much sharpened in focus. And if you're shooting with let's say a micro four thirds camera, I generally recommend shooting P mode, ISO 1600, using autofocus. The reason being is that autofocus on micro four thirds camera tends to be really, really fast. If you shoot with a camera that has really, really slow autofocus and you're photographing people who are moving in and out, then I recommend try using zone focusing, switching your camera to manual mode and pre-focusing it. On the Ricoh GR, which is really cool, let's say you're shooting aperture priority mode, and let's say you're shooting at f8, and then let's say your ISO is around 1600. You could actually use this mode with the Ricoh GR called snap mode, which is essentially zone focusing. You pre-focus to a certain distance. Upon snap mode, and then you could pre-focus it to 1 meter, 1.5 meters, and so forth. Generally, I'll just keep it pre-focused to 1 meter because I like to shoot close. And so when you take a photo, click, the camera doesn't actually have to focus. And this shooting zone focusing is best when you're photographing subjects who are quickly moving close to you or away from you, and you don't want to worry about the focus being in focus or not. So, and yeah, but at the end of the day, I'm the biggest fan of P mode. Just set it and forget it, and focus more on the composition, getting close, overcoming your fears of shooting street photography, and ultimately just experiment with all these different modes of street photography in terms of technical settings. In the end of the day, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Just do what works best for you. And if you find a setting or technical whatever that works best for you, stick with it and just focus on making beautiful images. All right, thanks guys for watching. Until next time, see you guys on the streets. Peace out.